Welcome to an all-new audio adventure. To fully enjoy this experience, it is highly recommended that you use headphones and close your eyes, but keep your screen close to your face, as there will be things that happen on screen to further immerse your experience. Just remember to keep your eyes shut. We now invite you to enjoy The Cult, a short story set in the world of H.P. Lovecraft, written by Casey Masterson and read by Sean Risch. It is both gnawing guilt and unceasing thoughts that move my hand to write. Guilt is unfounded, some may say, if what you perceive to have done has never occurred, at least if it has never occurred in the perception of those around you. You may think I have gone mad, and I cannot argue against this myself. As of my guilt, I have no proof, yet I know that what happened was not some illusion of my senses. I know that the object of my guilt is not one of pure imagination. I am writing here, on this unbiased piece of paper, to impress my thoughts onto something that cannot resist nor question them. It was a cool fall day when this madness began. A day like any other that would become one of the last perfectly sane days of my life. I stood before the class in the rustic lecture hall of Miskatonic University, leaning against my desk as I spoke of times long since past. The room, as one could see, was old and yet had not fallen into disrepair. Wooden desks of exceptional quality stood before the rows of seats. The chairs themselves were cushioned and lined with leather, upheld by solid wooden legs. Some students had carved words or obscene pictures into the wooden arms of the chairs, though the university had taken excessive care to buff out the especially obscene. The walls were of wooden paneling covering the bricks that made up the building and boasted ordinately carved trim. The paneling, I presume, was deemed far more aesthetically pleasing than the brick alone. The floor under the students' desks were lined with the finest tiling, which was a modern addition as the floors were originally wood. The tile was dark, to play off of the lighter paneling on the walls. On the windows were velvet red curtains, which were drawn so the students could see the projection behind me without a glare. A PowerPoint was projected on the newly installed whiteboard, which was slowly starting to replace all of the blackboards in the building. I had been lecturing on the witch trials in Salem. As they occurred in the same state as that of our university, students tended to find this lecture rather interesting. They could learn of the history of our region of the United States, along with an interesting, and albeit slightly distressing, part of our history. The silly game of schoolgirls had truly caused horrible consequences for many in Salem. A student towards the front of the room, whose name was Peter, asked the accursed question that triggered it all. He asked if Arkham's residents had any symptoms of the craze that overtook those in Salem, as our town had occasional whispers of veins of the occult running through it. It had been this way for centuries, though no one truly gave these stories merit. Well, that is to say, no one of what the public may consider respectable status gave them merit. People appear every now and again claiming to have seen such and such paranormal event or so and so demonic cult. It was a fair question that seemed to arouse interest from the class. The short answer to his question was yes, but unfortunately we were running out of time for the day. I informed him of a seemingly harmless book that spoke of a local occultist group that was pursued in this time period. I was such a fool! No one gave these occultists much merit, though they had claimed to be capable of monstrous feats. They were largely wiped out in this time period as paranoia of witches grew rampant, though many believe that some had escaped persecution. I foolishly did not pay this information much regard. This seemed to pique interest, and there was a soft murmur between several students to check out this book, but the rest of the remaining time we had went by peacefully thereafter. The next class, which was 2 days later, I entered the room to see a majority of the class surrounding Peter as he read from a book. He told of the capturing of the head of the local occult and his subsequent hanging. I humored him by engaging in the text momentarily with the class, before drawing everyone's attention back to the lecture for the day. Scenes such as the one I had walked into that day occurred more and more frequently, until eventually their minds seemed to belong to nothing else. They would not pay attention to lectures as they had before. They had been such an engaging class, but they now had ceased to participate any more. They seemed to be entrapped by this particular topic. I contributed to their conversations less and less as it became more frequent. I had grown tired of hearing nothing but this cult from them, so I offered the students a solution. I would give a special lecture on the topic of the cult they had become enthralled in at the end of the week, if they promised to pay attention to the other lectures. This resounded in a boisterous applause and an excitement that was expressed at almost an obscene level. They were the perfect models of students for the rest of that week. I reserved a room for the promised lecture, in one of the most foolish decisions of my life, and utilized my free time to prepare the damnable speech for my students. What I found in my research was revolting, but I could see how my students managed to grow such a fascination. A vast majority of people tend to enjoy learning of the horrifically strange aspects of life. Life, as they say, is stranger than fiction. The name of this cult was shrouded in mystery. The members of the cult themselves dared not to speak it, as it was deemed too sacred for mortal ears. The sane of those who heard the name found it too grotesque a word to sully their mouths with. The mere sighting of it could send chills down a person's spine and have a cold sweat run down their necks. Only the accursed Necronomicon dares to have the cult's name transcribed within its pages, but I dare not write it here. The rituals of this cult, which are clearly listed in that forsaken grimoire, were almost as unspeakable as their names. The roots of the cult, as I have found through studying various academic articles, seem to be European, although I cannot place a country of origin as it was practiced widely, and was brought to America along with some of its foremost immigrants. The cult is thought to have died out aside from the few members who live in secret in their immortality. The cult gained approval, or so they claim, from an unknown and demonic god through the screams of their victims as they were tortured. Then, once satisfied with the screams, they are to drain their victim of blood while keeping them alive for long as possible. As they share in the forbidden nectar of their offering, the monstrous entity rewards them with rejuvenated souls that allow its followers to remain immortal. They have to perform this ritual often to maintain the favor of the accursed center of their religion. Any creature will do, animal or human. They have been repulsively quoted as saying, "The younger the blood, the stronger the spirit." The cult was stopped in their disturbing actions by the peasants, who mistook them for witches in their detestable actions. Some escaped, evidently, and it is said that these people still live today and practice their forbidden and horrific rituals in secret. I gave the students this information in my lecture. Instead of growing disgusted at the rituals that had filled me with unpleasant thoughts and had a feeling of excessive distaste, they seemed to hang on to my every word. Hearing about these deplorable actions seemed to fill them with the utmost satisfaction and put a twinkle in their eyes that sent shivers down my spine. The more I spoke on the topic, the more uneasy I became, as I started to notice the increasing joy the students seemed to have from a lecture of such a dismal topic. As I finished, I asked the class if they had any questions. With little hesitation, Peter's hand shot into the air with an unsettling eagerness. "Are these rituals really in the Necronomicon?" I hesitated with my answer, as I feared where Peter may be going with this. Of all the students, Peter had seemed the most enamored with my lecture. I told him I am not sure." Peter gave me a look, then smirked to himself as he seemed to come to a realization. The smirk he gave was beyond explanation, as it was full of an evil I dare not describe. Some horrendous and malicious idea was hiding behind that smile. As the class started to leave, I assured myself that Peter, or no one else in the class, had access to the Necronomicon. It was not an easy book to obtain, especially for a college student with little resources. I nearly had a moment of peace in this assurance, until I had the realization that made my heart skip a beat. The Necronomicon was in the university library. He knew. I called the librarian's staff shortly thereafter to see that he made sure Peter did not go near the book. He was confused with my request, but he informed me someone had already checked it out, though the university and library policy prevented him from telling me who it was. He was able to assure me, however, that it was not Peter. This washed away my anxieties in a wave of relief. I thanked him before retiring to my office. The research that I had to complete for this lecture made me behind on the papers I needed to grade and emails I needed to send. I was relieved to finally be able to begin the work I had missed. As I sat down in my comfortable swivel chair, which had a gray wool cushion with a black plastic arm and base, it was cheaper than the chairs in my lecture hall, but still durable and comfortable. My office was stacked with books and papers in an organized chaos that only I knew how to navigate. On my desk I had pictures of my nieces, myself, and my sister at her wedding, and my dog, Sammy. My laptop occupied the only clean spot on my wooden desk. I opened it shortly after sitting before it. I gazed out the window at the setting sun that overlooked a grassy area where the students would often play frisbee, relax with a good book, or pass leisurely hours away chatting with friends on the benches surrounding it. The patch of grass was surrounded by large trees that casted a shadow over the grass with the setting sun. There were scarcely any students there, as it was a Friday evening. They were all out with friends and living their lives. As I typed away on my laptop, dusk gave way to night. Around that time I had switched to grading papers, red pen marking here and there in order to make the proper corrections. I often got carried away with these things and was there for quite a long time. Just as I pulled out the last paper to grade, I heard a gut-wrenching shriek. This shriek made me hop from my seat and turn my blood cold. I rushed to the windows to see what was going on, but I could not see anything. Although the field was pitch black at night, I could tell that the continuing shrieks came from there. I raced from my office without another thought to try and decipher the source of this cry. I kept telling myself my imagination was acting up due to the lecture from earlier today. It was nothing. The subject matter was just influencing my thoughts. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the motion-censored lights flashed on. The powerful lights illuminated the barren concrete about me, along with a few feet of the field. That is when I saw them. Figures, robed in black, were bent over a cat, which was the source of the unholy shrieking. I could not see under their hoods, but I saw the glimmer of a knife in one of their hands, and the panicked eyes of the cat below. There were at least 20 of the figures, but only 3 of them were willing to get their hands dirty. One held the cat down, while the other towered over it. The third was holding a book I could not currently see the contents of, but the ominous presence allowed me to assume it was the Necronomicon. All of the figures were looking at me now. I stood frozen in my spot for but a moment before racing forward. I do not know what I was thinking. Perhaps I thought that if I just caught one of them, but they raced away as soon as I had drawn near. I found myself stopping by the cat instead, inspecting it. They had broken one of the poor creature's legs. As I moved to pick it up, the cat bit me in fear. With gentle and reassuring pets, I managed to gain her trust. She eventually let me pick her up, even as she mewed in pain. I brought the poor thing to an emergency veterinary center, where they fixed up her leg. I called the police, as the veterinarian took care of her. They assured me that they would be on the lookout for any suspicious characters that night. The cat made it through the procedure just fine. She had to have her leg in a cast, poor thing, but the doctor said that she would heal. As the cat did not have any collar, and I had no idea how to find her owner, I brought her home and resolved to put up posters for her on Monday. Isis, as I decided to call her, curled up on my lap almost anywhere I sat down. She was a tabby and a truly sweet one. Sammy would eye the cat curiously, but he stayed away. They ended up getting along just fine by the end of the night. Isis slept by my pillow, and Sammy slept at my feet without disturbing one another. My night was plagued by nightmares in which the terrified screams of Isis replayed over and over. It was the first of my never-ending nightmares. The next day went on without incident. I was happy to get the thoughts of yesterday out of my head. I visited my sister and told her of what had come to pass. She helped to calm my nerves, but what had helped the most was perhaps tea time with my nieces, who were so young and sweet. Things went downhill once I returned home that night. I got home late, as traffic from my sister's home had been a nightmare in and of itself. I was anxious to get in bed, and Sammy and Isis were anxious to accompany me. Sleep came easily, but I was awoken before I could begin to dream by Sammy's barking. It was a violent bark, one that I had never heard from him before. The golden retriever snarled and howled at the window. His fur was standing on its ends as he stood on the bed, ready to lunge. Isis meowed helplessly and pawed at me. Her ears were pushed back and her fur was also standing on its ends. Something was wrong. I stood from my bed and walked cautiously to the window. I opened the curtains to look outside. I live in the thick woods on the outskirts of Arkham, where light barely passes between the trees from the moon. Standing just before the woods were the black-robed figures. Multiple of them carried torches, and they all chanted something ominous and low that I could not make out from inside. What terrified me the most was what they had done to my lawn. In the light of their torches, I could see they had sprinkled blood all over it. I could also see the source of where it came from. There were 10 severed heads of animals on pikes in my yard. Cat heads. I nearly threw up as I beheld them in horror, unable to look away. Evidently, one of the robed figures noticed me in the window as they advanced to the house. They did not hold a flame, so I could not see under their hood. They took one of their pikes from the ground and raised it higher for me to better see. It was at that point I reeled away from the window and stumbled back to my bed. I trembled, hoping that they would go away, that they would do something other than just stand menacingly still. I grabbed my phone from my nightstand and called the police, at which point the band of hooded figures dispersed, leaving the gruesome display on my yard. Sunday night, I stayed at my sister's house, taking Sammy and Isis with me. She once again tried to soothe my anxieties, but she was unsuccessful. My hands trembled throughout the entire day. I could not get a wink of sleep that night. I had my lecture at around 10 in the morning the next day. I was sleep-deprived and looked that way. I did not hear the usual chattering when I walked in. Silence. When I came into view, I noticed something that made me tremble. They were all staring at me. Not the normal engaged or expectant stare students had, but an empty and cold stare matched with blank expressions. I asked them all how their weekends went. I received no response. I asked them how they enjoyed the lecture that they had been dying for. Peter smirked that evil grin, which was matched with dead eyes. He did not say anything in accompaniment. I felt as though running from the room was the proper thing to do. I gave about half my intended lecture, and their eyes never moved from me. They just stared with cold, unblinking eyes. As my anxiety grew to a peak, I called class off early. I claimed that I was not feeling well, but no one seemed to care. They simply got up with robotic movements and left the classroom in silence. As I traveled about the university that day, I recognized that I always had eyes on me. Wherever I looked over my shoulder or turned a new corner, I saw that there was always a student who stared at me with an unfeeling stare. I grew paranoid quickly. This pattern repeated for days. I would be stared at constantly at the university, and at home I noticed figures moving about in the shadows of the neighborhood. I refused to go back to my home, regardless of whether the police presumed that the area was safe. I knew they knew where I lived. I stopped staying at my sister's house in fear they would hurt her or my nieces, and moved to a run-down motel that allowed pets. I would not leave my 2 pets alone to defend them from the fate that may await them. I knew who they were. They were my students. I had no way to prove it, but I knew. I told the dean, but when he came to examine what I called strange behavior, the students were miraculously back to normal. It was only after he left that they returned to their true and malicious selves. Colleagues started to look at me strangely, and some students from other courses would avoid me. I had gone from a relatively relaxed man to one completely on edge. Gossip around campus was that I had lost it. It was not me who had lost it. No, it was them! This torture went on for weeks. I started calling out of that deplorable class as much as possible until the dean forbade it. Nothing stopped my torment. Not missing class, not going home, not sleep. Nothing! They found me everywhere. I lost my will to go to work when a severed arm appeared on my doorstep. It belonged to a student who had gone missing just the night before. I refused to go to work that day. Instead, I sought out a man in Arkham who used to work for the university. He was a man of science until he had found a love for the mystic. The university had deemed him unfit to teach science due to his newfound preachings and forced him into early retirement. I told him my whole story from the beginning. This seemed to fill him with horror. He revealed to me the source of my plight. I had interrupted the ritual that the students were going to perform on poor Isis. This had angered the god that they served, and he had taken away their souls rather than making them stronger. The only way for them to get their souls back was for them to sacrifice the one who had prevented their success. The old professor revealed to me that instead of physical torture, they had chosen torture that was psychological in nature. They would strike as I eventually broke down in screams of madness and anxiety. There was also, unfortunately for me, no cure. They were possessed by their newly soulless bodies and would not relent until they retrieved what was taken from them. I was, in short, doomed. I refused to believe this. I refused to believe that death was so near. In a desperate attempt for salvation, I returned to campus to seek the aid of the library. The Necronomicon had been returned, which baffled me. I flipped through pages to find something, anything that could help. The only spell I found was dastardly, and I dared not to consider it. It was how to destroy soulless beings. I knew that I would never, could never, do such a thing. Yet I found that I did not return the Necronomicon. Instead, I had brought it with me to the class I had no intention of going to. The rest of this I saw from an outsider perspective. I saw myself going through the motions, but I had no control of my own actions. The students at their desks saw the book in my hands. That horrible, evil smirk came on Peter's face. Returning the book had been a test of my breaking will and anxiety. I had lost. They collectively moved slowly and threateningly forward towards me. I glared them down, my hand wavering as I opened the book and spoke those accursed, detestable words. All at once, a green flame engulfed the room, and the students started screaming unholy screams that I shall never forget. They ran about, frightened, but could not escape the flame. It was when the flame encumbered me that I fell unconscious. When I awoke, I was in the hospital. The dean, as well as a doctor, stood over me. I was lucky to be alive, they said. There had been a gas leak in the room. A fast-acting gas had inexplicably gotten into the lecture hall. It got in and killed all the students, and nearly me. They had no way of explaining how the gas got in there, but the forensic squad had detected it. Guilt sat in my throat as they spoke. I told them that I had done it. I had set the fire using the Necronomicon to kill them, and I tried explaining my situation, but they stared at me blankly. They told me that I was delirious and that I needed to rest. I had no idea what I was saying. To this day, no one believes me. No one. Not the police, not the university. No one. I could not bring myself to return. I quit my position, not even 2 days from when I write this. I cannot live with this. I killed them all. They were in their prime, their golden years, and I snuffed them out. Why do I deserve to live over them? Susanna, my sweet sister, I leave Isis and Sammy to you. Take good care of them. Do not tell the girls their Uncle Benny went out this way.